Imagine a line that no animal on the planet would cross. No bird would fly across it. No mammal would dare to step over it. Can you imagine it? And now, let's make it even more intriguing. This line is invisible and does not exist in physical reality. But its impact is so mighty that even the forces of evolution are not always able to resist it. This mysterious barrier is the Wallace Line, 32 kilometers of water that no animal crosses. But why? How can an invisible boundary stop nature? What lurks behind this barrier? We're off to Indonesia to find out what we can about the mysterious boundary that cannot be crossed. If you are curious about the mysteries of our world, be sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Together, we can discover many more unexplored things. Let's go to Indonesia. Here is an invisible border between Bali and Lombok. On the western side of this border is the typical wildlife of Asia: tigers and bears, rhinos and elephants. But if you travel just 32 kilometers to the east, you will find the world of kangaroos and Komodo dragons. The boundary that delineates the two realms, Asian and Australian, is known as the Wallace Line. And at first glance, it's just a strip of ocean that doesn't exhibit any visible features. But scientists have been trying to unravel its mystery for more than 150 years. So what is there so extraordinary about it? Let's move for a second to any other corner of our planet. You would see animals covering incredible distances to breed or find food. For example, birds can fly thousands of kilometers, migrating between continents. And sea turtles swim hundreds of kilometers to return to the beach where they once hatched. Yes, that's homesickness. Animals can cross mountains and oceans. But things are different here at the Wallace Line. No animal dares to cross it. The Wallace Line is an invisible but insurmountable barrier to most native wildlife. Imagine just around 30 kilometers of water. No big deal for turtles, lizards, or birds, right? But here's the thing, they don't cross this narrow strait. Neither mammals nor reptiles from Lombok would dare to go to the coast of Bali. They probably wouldn't do so even if their island was hit by a massive fire or 10-meter tsunami. While tigers and monitor lizards from Bali are unlikely to ever see the equatorial forests of Lombok. Even birds strictly adhere to the stringent boundary, with only bats occasionally crossing it. The mysterious line isn't just separating two neighboring islands. It marks the border between two ecosystems, and it may seem like it can't be crossed from a purely physical standpoint. Is it really so? And how did the Wallace Line originate anyway? Let's start from the very beginning. In fact, the mystery of the invisible line was almost solved already in the 15th century. As early as in 1521, Antonio Pigafetta, a member of Magellan's expedition, noticed that the nature of the Philippines and the Maluku Islands was very different, despite their proximity. He wrote this down in his journal, but no other clue was found. The mystery of the line remained unsolved until the 19th century, and it was Alfred Wallace who solved it and changed science forever. In 1854, Wallace started an expedition through the Malay archipelago and noticed that the flora and fauna on the different sides of the strait between Bali and Lombok were very dissimilar, like two completely different worlds. One world, South Asian, was inhabited by tigers, rhinos, and elephants. The other world, Australia, was home to koalas, other marsupials, and cockatoos. This geographical divide raised many questions in Wallace's mind that science could not answer. Over 8 years, Wallace collected over 125,000 specimens, which enabled him to make significant discoveries. The explorer discussed his discoveries with Charles Darwin at the time. Yes, those discoveries somewhat formed the basis of the theory of evolution then. However, Wallace did not succeed in unraveling the nature of the mystical barrier. To grasp it, we need to look into the distant past, when the Earth looked quite different. Millions of years ago, the continents we know were part of one supercontinent, Pangaea. Pangaea was a paradise for animal migration. Even the largest of them, including the dinosaurs, could move freely across the enormous territory. Oceans and seas had not yet separated the land masses, and there was nothing to prevent the spread of species. But such unity could not last forever. Pangaea was destined to split apart. Was this an ill fate? No, there's quite a logical explanation for the splitting of Pangaea. The point is that the continents rest on massive platforms, tectonic plates. Throughout the entire history of our planet, the plates have been constantly moving and interacting, never stopping for a single moment. What might this interaction look like? From the very depths of the Earth, hot magma rises to the surface and literally pushes neighboring plates apart. For instance, this is how the North American and Eurasian plates are still moving apart, just very slowly, a couple of centimeters a year. As plates move apart, so do the continents that lie on them, and Pangaea simply didn't stand a chance. When Pangaea broke apart, the continents scattered apart like huge pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. New oceans and mountain ranges became impassable barriers for animals. But how could this have such a profound effect on the evolution of species? Let's take a closer look. Each isolated region was now an incubator for its own unique ecosystem. At the same time, the movement of the continents dramatically changed the climate, which meant their inhabitants had to further adapt to the new conditions. Thus, species deprived of the possibility of migration began to develop independently of each other. Although such changes affected all continents, they were most evident in the South Asian region. Here, the lands of Sunda and Sahul played a key role in the evolution of species. Millions of years ago, Sunda and Sahul connected Asia to Australia, serving as bridges for migration. But after the Ice Age, ocean levels rose, and these lands were flooded, forming a water barrier. Asia and Australia could no longer exchange flora and fauna. A water barrier stretched between them. Fine, but a water barrier can be crossed. So why do animals refuse to do so? It's simple. The Wallace line is the boundary between two worlds, where climate and nature are fundamentally different. Remember, wildlife on both sides of the line has evolved in isolation for millions of years. Even if animals physically cross the boundary, whether they swim or fly across the strait, they will not be able to adapt to the conditions on the other side, and eventually they would die. The explanation seems quite simple and logical, doesn't it? And yet, this important boundary was not recognized until a decade after its discovery. And there's a simple explanation for that, too. Wallace was ahead of his time, and it was not until years later that his ideas were embraced. In the 1960s, biogeography became popular, and the boundary he described was called the Wallace line. But was this really the end of the story? Well, there was another unexpected surprise waiting for scientists. It turned out that the Wallace line was not a unique phenomenon. Here's the surprise. Wallace line turned out to be not the only one. How many other mysterious boundaries do you think are hiding in nature? German scientist Max Weber has found another one, and it was just the beginning. And it's not somewhere on the other side of the world, but very close to the Wallace line in Indonesia. What is the name of this barrier? Quite obviously, the Weber line. It was an important refinement of the Wallace line. It divides the same regions of fauna, Asian and Australian, but it runs a little further east and reflects the boundary of the stable balance between both regions for mammals and other terrestrial vertebrates. Further to the east is the Lydecker line, named after the English biologist Richard Lydecker. This line marks the eastern edge of species distribution. It separates the Australian continent and New Guinea from the rest of the islands of the Malay archipelago. And each of these lines is a powerful divider. Some animals simply won't dare to swim across them. Others simply won't survive on the other side. Birds can cross invisible barriers by air, but what are they supposed to do on the other side in a completely unfamiliar habitat? Okay, that's how it is with animals, but what about plants? Are they equally picky in terms of choice? Or can they cross invisible barriers freely? Not really. Flora is more capable of crossing these boundaries than fauna, since seeds and spores can be easily carried by the wind or through ocean currents. However, the Wallace line and other lines represent major filters that constrain and limit the spread of the plants. For example, the vast majority of eucalyptus species are only found on the Australian side of the Wallace line. And the only exception is the rainbow eucalyptus, which has comfortably migrated to the other side of the barrier on the Philippine island of Mindanao. Do you see the regularity? The simpler the species, the easier it is for it to cross the Wallace line. For microorganisms, it doesn't seem to be a big challenge at all. However, something extraordinary happened in ancient times. One of the most sophisticated living organisms on Earth managed to cross the Wallace line. Not in spite of its sophistication, but because of it. Guess who we're talking about? That's right, about an ancient human. In the 21st century, researchers discovered that the Denisovans, the extinct ancient relatives of modern humans, had managed to cross the sea barrier. Having found a high percentage of Denisovans' DNA in modern Papuans and Australians, the researchers concluded that they were able to cross the Wallace line and had even made a small return migration to the west. Admittedly, this journey must have been very difficult for them. The sea level in the Wallace line area was quite shallow back then, but the currents were supposedly so strong that navigation was a nightmare. So how did they manage to get across? In contrast to the animals, the Denisovans had the ultimate advantage. Do you have any idea what that was? That's right, tools. They could make the simple floating crafts that could be used to cross the barrier. Eventually, the Denisovans crossed the Wallace line and ended up somewhere in the eastern part of the Malaysia region and disappeared. That's how suddenly the traces of the Denisovans are lost here. Genetic tests have shown that Denisovan DNA is found only in indigenous peoples living east of the Wallace line. For example, in Australia and New Guinea. And yet it is almost entirely absent in populations in mainland Asia, even though Denisovan remains were originally found in Siberia. How is this even possible? Some researchers believe that only a small group of Denisovans were able to cross the Wallace line. They settled in the Australian region, where they came into contact with the ancestors of modern humans, and the latter populated Australia and nearby islands. So the DNA of Denisovans remained only on the eastern side of the Wallace line. However, the topic itself still remains a subject for heated discussions. Indeed, there are no archaeological finds of Denisovans in Oceania. Some believe that the Denisovans did leave a significant genetic trace in Asia, but only for a while, after they were wiped off by waves of migrations of a new species of people, Homo sapiens. So the researchers still have no consensus on this issue, and it seems we need a new Alfred Wallace to find one.